For months, one of the biggest mysteries surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance has centered on two ransom notes. Investigators have examined every sentence, every punctuation mark, and every word, hoping to find something that might point them toward the person responsible. Until recently, those notes were largely viewed as little more than demands for money and possible attempts to mislead investigators. Now, according to a veteran homicide detective who has spent decades studying violent offenders, those notes may contain something far more revealing than anyone first realized. Not physical fingerprints, hidden fingerprints of personality, the kind that can reveal how someone thinks, what kind of life they've lived, and even whether more than one person may have been involved. Today, we're taking a closer look at those newly discussed details, why certain words have caught investigators' attention months after Nancy vanished, and how those words could reshape the direction of this investigation. Before we begin, if you enjoy thoughtful updates that focus on facts instead of speculation, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps us continue bringing you carefully researched coverage of important cases like this one. Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her Tucson, Arizona home during the early morning hours after an armed intruder reportedly forced entry into the residence. Authorities have said there were clear signs of violence at the scene, including blood found near the front entrance. From the beginning, investigators believed this was not a voluntary disappearance, but a violent abduction. Almost immediately, attention turned toward finding Nancy alive. Family members pleaded publicly for information. Law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, joined the investigation. Search teams combed neighborhoods, desert terrain, and nearby communities. Every passing day increased concern for Nancy's safety. Then came the ransom notes. The first note reportedly claimed that Nancy was alive and demanded $6 million in Bitcoin. As with most kidnapping investigations, investigators had to consider whether the message actually came from the kidnapper or from someone attempting to interfere with the investigation. Those are two very different possibilities, and distinguishing between them is often one of the earliest challenges detectives face. The family responded publicly, hoping that whoever had taken Nancy would provide proof that she was still alive. But another detail stood out. Just days later, a second message reportedly arrived. According to people familiar with the investigation, that note suggested Nancy had died. It no longer focused on negotiating a ransom. Instead, it claimed that she had perished and had been buried with nature. It also reportedly expressed regret, stating that her physical condition had been more serious than the kidnappers had realized. At first, that seemed straightforward. Perhaps the kidnappers were trying to explain why their original plan had failed. But experienced investigators often ask a different question. Why was the message written that way? Former homicide detective Chris McDonough recently discussed those notes during an interview, and rather than focusing on the money or the timeline, he focused on the language itself. Years of interviewing suspects have taught him that people often reveal far more about themselves through ordinary conversation than they intend. His attention was drawn to two words in particular: perish and nature. To many people, they may not seem unusual, but to someone who has spent years interviewing violent offenders, they stood out immediately. According to McDonough, career criminals rarely describe a victim as having perished. It isn't impossible, but it isn't common. Most offenders who commit violent crimes tend to use much simpler, more direct language. The word perish carries a more formal tone. It sounds deliberate. It sounds almost literary. The same was true of the phrase, buried with nature. Again, detectives are careful not to jump to conclusions based on a single phrase. Language alone does not solve a case. But when unusual wording appears alongside other evidence, investigators begin asking whether those choices reveal something about the author. Could the writer have a higher level of education? Could they work in a profession that requires strong written communication? Or was someone else writing on behalf of the people responsible for the kidnapping? That brings us to another detail that investigators reportedly found intriguing. Throughout portions of the communication, the writer referred to we, not I, not me, we. That simple pronoun opened an entirely different line of thinking. Was the writer telling the truth about multiple people being involved, or was we simply being used to make one individual appear larger, more organized, or more intimidating? Detectives have encountered both situations before. Sometimes a group commits a crime together. Other times, a single offender deliberately creates the illusion of multiple participants to confuse investigators. Without additional evidence, there is no way to know which explanation is correct. Still, experienced investigators rarely ignore patterns like these. McDonough also pointed out something that many viewers may have overlooked. If the people behind the ransom notes truly wanted money, why were the messages reportedly sent to media organizations instead of directly to the family? That decision changes the entire dynamic. Normally, kidnappers seeking payment want direct communication. They want negotiations. They want proof that their demands are being heard. Sending messages through news organizations creates delays. It introduces uncertainty. It also increases publicity. That raises another question. Was obtaining money really the primary objective? Or was someone attempting to control the public narrative while keeping investigators occupied? Details remain unclear, and authorities have not publicly confirmed every aspect of the communications. Even so, the unusual wording, the indirect delivery, and the shifting messages have continued to generate discussion among investigators following the case. And then, something unexpected happened. As more information about those notes became public, investigators and analysts began looking beyond what the messages said. They started asking what the writer may have accidentally revealed about themselves, because sometimes the most important fingerprint isn't left on the paper. Sometimes it's hidden in the words. If the unusual wording in those ransom notes was enough to make investigators pause, what came next raised even more questions. Former homicide detective Chris McDonough believes the language cannot be examined in isolation. Every sentence has to be considered alongside the actions of the person who wrote it. In his view, words and behavior should tell the same story. When they don't, detectives start looking for an explanation. According to McDonough, one of the biggest contradictions involves the tone of the second note. The writer reportedly apologized. The message suggested that Nancy's death had not been intentional. It claimed that whoever took her had not understood the seriousness of her medical condition and expressed sympathy for her family. On the surface, that might sound like someone carrying a guilty conscience. But McDonough questioned whether that fit the crime itself. Authorities have said Nancy was taken from her home in the middle of the night during a violent abduction. Records released by investigators indicate there was blood outside the residence, suggesting force was used almost immediately. If those details are accurate, detectives have to ask whether someone willing to commit that kind of violence would suddenly become compassionate only days later. The contrast is difficult to ignore. One moment, someone is reportedly breaking into the home of an 84-year-old woman under the cover of darkness. The next, a message appears expressing regret and concern for her health. According to McDonough, those two behaviors do not naturally fit together. That doesn't necessarily mean the note is fake. It simply means investigators have to determine whether the writer is being truthful, attempting to manipulate the family, or perhaps trying to create an image of themselves that doesn't match reality. Then another detail stood out. The second note reportedly claimed that nothing you could have done could have changed the outcome. It's an unusual sentence. Rather than demanding money or making new threats, the writer appears to be reassuring the family that they were not responsible for Nancy's death. Investigators often pay close attention to statements like that because they sometimes reveal what psychologists refer to as leakage. Without intending to, a writer may expose emotions they are trying to hide, or reveal priorities that don't make sense for someone committing the crime. Was the message written to comfort the family, or was it written to ease the writer's own conscience? No one knows. But detectives continue asking those questions, because language sometimes reveals motives that evidence alone cannot. That brings us to another point McDonough found particularly interesting. Instead of contacting Nancy's family directly, the messages reportedly went to local media organizations before eventually reaching national outlets. At first glance, that might not seem especially important, but experienced investigators often focus on what criminals choose to do when no one is forcing them. If ransom money is the goal, direct communication usually offers the quickest path to negotiations. Every extra step increases the chance that law enforcement will become involved before any payment is discussed. So why involve television stations? Why create headlines instead of private negotiations? McDonough believes those choices deserve careful examination. One possibility is that someone wanted attention. Another is that the writer hoped public pressure would influence investigators or the family. There is also the possibility that the messages came from someone who was never involved in the kidnapping at all. History offers several examples of major criminal investigations attracting people who insert themselves into the case. Some seek publicity, others want money. A few simply enjoy creating confusion during an already difficult investigation. Authorities reportedly considered those possibilities from the beginning. That would have been the end of it. But another development complicated matters even further. According to reports discussed during the interview, investigators found similarities suggesting the notes may have originated from the same internet source. While officials have not publicly disclosed every technical detail, the reported connection meant detectives could not simply dismiss the communications outright. They had to keep investigating. At the same time, another media organization began receiving its own series of messages. Unlike the earlier ransom notes, these emails reportedly came from someone claiming to know where Nancy was being held. The sender allegedly asked for money in exchange for information, later suggesting that time was no longer of the essence. Again, investigators faced a familiar problem. Were they dealing with the actual offender, or someone taking advantage of a national story? For detectives, separating meaningful evidence from background noise is one of the hardest parts of an active investigation. Every phone call has to be reviewed, every email has to be traced, every tip has to be evaluated. Most lead nowhere, but overlooking the right one could have devastating consequences. While all of this was unfolding, Nancy's daughter, Savannah Guthrie, continued making public appeals for help. During an emotional appearance on national television, she acknowledged that the family believed the 2 ransom notes were likely genuine. She also pleaded with anyone who knew anything to come forward, emphasizing that even the smallest piece of information could matter. It was a difficult moment to watch. Here was someone balancing 2 very different roles. She was a respected journalist, sitting at the news desk. But she was also a daughter, desperately searching for answers about her mother. McDonough said investigators must always separate emotion from evidence. Families naturally hold on to hope for as long as possible. Detectives, however, have to evaluate every development through the eyes of the offender rather than through the emotions of those left behind. That perspective can be uncomfortable, but it often leads investigators toward questions that others might overlook. One of those questions involved geography. After spending time in Tucson examining the neighborhood where Nancy disappeared, McDonough reached a conclusion that differed from some public speculation. Although rumors had circulated suggesting Nancy might have been taken across the border into Mexico, he said he was not convinced by that theory. Instead, he believes the person, or people, responsible likely had strong local knowledge, someone familiar with the streets, the neighborhoods, the desert surrounding Tucson, someone who understood the area well enough to move without attracting attention. Whether that assessment proves correct remains to be seen. Authorities have not confirmed where Nancy was taken after leaving her home, and many aspects of the investigation remain under seal. Even so, McDonough believes the answers may not lie hundreds of miles away. They may be much closer than anyone expected. And if that's true, then those unusual words hidden inside the ransom notes may represent only one piece of a much larger puzzle, one that investigators are still trying to assemble, piece by piece. As investigators continued examining the ransom notes, one conclusion became increasingly difficult to ignore. The words themselves may never identify the person responsible, but they could reveal the kind of person detectives are looking for. Former homicide detective Chris McDonough believes investigators should think of the notes as a behavioral fingerprint. Just as physical fingerprints can connect someone to a crime scene, a person's writing style can sometimes reveal habits, education, personality, and even relationships with other people. That doesn't solve the case on its own, but it helps narrow the field. One of the biggest questions still facing investigators is whether the person who wrote the notes is the same person who carried out the kidnapping. Those two roles are not always filled by the same individual. In some criminal investigations, one person commits the physical act, while another handles communication. Detectives have seen cases where someone with stronger writing skills drafts messages, while another carries out the crime itself. McDonough believes that possibility cannot be dismissed here. He has pointed to the contrast between what appears to be a relatively unsophisticated abduction and the more polished language found in parts of the correspondence. According to his analysis, those two things do not naturally fit together. The individual caught on surveillance video reportedly appeared awkward while handling a firearm. McDonough has previously noted that the weapons seemed to be held in an unusual manner, raising questions about whether the suspect had much experience using it. If that observation is accurate, it paints the picture of someone who may not be an experienced violent offender. Yet the wording inside the notes suggests someone comfortable expressing themselves through writing. Could those two descriptions belong to the same person? Possibly. Could they describe two different people? That remains possible as well. At this stage, investigators have not publicly identified any suspects, and authorities have been careful not to draw conclusions before all the evidence is examined. That caution is understandable. Cases involving ransom notes have a long history of misleading investigators. Sometimes the messages are genuine. Other times they are written to delay an investigation, shift suspicion, or simply create confusion. Every possibility has to be tested against the evidence. That brings us to another important point. Throughout the investigation, law enforcement has repeatedly urged the public to avoid jumping to conclusions based on rumors circulating online. In a case that has attracted national attention, speculation spreads quickly. A single comment on social media can become tomorrow's headline before investigators have had an opportunity to verify it. That's why experienced detectives return to the same principle over and over again. Follow the evidence. Not assumptions, not theories, not public opinion. Evidence. McDonough also emphasized another challenge that detectives face after a kidnapping. If Nancy died shortly after being taken, as suggested in the reported communications, the people responsible would suddenly have a completely different problem: moving a victim without being detected. According to investigators, every stage of that process creates another potential crime scene. The home where Nancy disappeared, the vehicle used to leave the neighborhood, the location where she may have been held, any place where the ransom notes were written or transmitted, and finally, wherever the offender or offenders ultimately went afterward. Each location has the potential to leave behind physical evidence, surveillance footage, vehicle sightings, cell phone records, digital activity, DNA, fibers. Even the smallest detail can become significant months later when investigators begin comparing timelines. That is one reason Cold cases are sometimes solved years after the crime occurred. Evidence that once seemed unrelated suddenly fits into place. Technology improves, new witnesses come forward, old assumptions are challenged, and investigators see connections that were impossible to recognize during those first hectic days. In Nancy Guthrie's case, investigators have continued encouraging anyone with information, no matter how insignificant it may seem, to contact the FBI. Someone may remember seeing an unfamiliar vehicle. Someone may recall an unusual conversation. Someone may have dismissed an observation months ago that now carries new meaning. Those small details have solved cases before. They could help solve this one as well. For Nancy's family, however, every day without answers has brought another day of uncertainty. Savannah Guthrie has spoken publicly about the pain her family continues to experience, describing how the search for answers never truly stops. Even while continuing her work in front of millions of television viewers, she has repeatedly asked the public not to forget her mother. It was one of the most emotional moments in the investigation, not because investigators announced a breakthrough, but because viewers saw the human cost behind the headlines. A daughter trying to remain composed while asking complete strangers for help. A family living between hope and heartbreak. Those moments serve as a reminder that behind every investigation is a family waiting for a phone call that hasn't come. As for the ransom notes themselves, they remain one of the most intriguing pieces of evidence discussed publicly. Were the unusual words intentional? Did the writer accidentally reveal their background? Was "we" a truthful statement or a deliberate attempt to mislead investigators? Why were the notes reportedly routed through media organizations instead of being sent directly to the family? Those questions remain unanswered. What is clear is that investigators are continuing to examine every available piece of evidence, including the language used in those communications. Sometimes, the smallest detail, a word, a phrase, or even the order of a sentence, can point detectives in a direction they hadn't previously considered. Whether those concealed behavioral fingerprints ultimately help identify the person responsible remains to be seen, but investigators clearly believe they are worth studying. And in complex investigations like this one, patience often becomes just as important as persistence. The public rarely sees every piece of evidence law enforcement is working with. Detectives intentionally hold certain information back to protect the integrity of the investigation and to help verify future confessions or witness statements. That means some of the most important developments may never become public until an arrest is made. Until then, investigators continue following every credible lead, reviewing every tip, and searching for the one piece of evidence that finally connects the dots. If you've been following the Nancy Guthrie case, we'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you believe the wording in the ransom notes reveals something meaningful about the person who wrote them? Or do you think it was designed only to confuse investigators? Let us know your perspective in the comments below. If you found this update informative, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with someone else who follows ongoing true crime investigations. Your support helps us continue producing thoughtful, fact-based coverage of cases that deserve continued public attention. Thank you for watching, and as always, we'll continue following this investigation closely and bring you any significant developments as they become available. Stay safe, take care of yourselves, and we'll see you in the next update.